All right, it's 8 o'clock, so we get started.
Go ahead.
Sounds good.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar at the Almond Board, where we're going to be discussing post-harvest weed management considerations. My name is Miranda Thomas, and I am the program assistant for the Research and Innovation Department at the Almond Board, so welcome. Just a quick note for housekeeping on navigating Teams. We would like you to please all mute your audio by pressing the microphone, and you can tap that to mute and unmute, and you can also turn your camera off and by clicking that as well. If you are on your cell phone and don't have the muting capabilities on your phone, you can press *6. And we also encourage everyone to use the chat window and place any questions or comments throughout the webinar. We'll stop periodically to address your questions. So go ahead and fire away if anything comes up throughout the webinar.
Miranda, we're having some people that can't hear, so.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is that any better for the folks that couldn't hear?
Okay, we have some that's saying they can hear on the computer feed. Okay, it might just be a cell phone, so go ahead and continue.
Okay. So for today's agenda, Drew's going to talk about scouting control options, and then we have Ben Duesterhaus, who's going to present his thoughts for post-harvest weed control and almonds, and then we're going to have open questions, and at the end we'll have just a few events coming up for the Almond Board, and then the exam for DPR credit. And just a few things to note for those of you who are tuning in to receive DPR credit. If you haven't registered yet, please register as soon as you can. We are going to be taking roll and monitoring your attendance throughout the webinar. So halfway through, Drew is going to ask you to like this meme that will be dropped in the chat box. And if you all can just like it by moving your toggle mouse over the meme, and then the option of like with a thumbs up will be there. If you fail to actively participate in these checkpoints, then we will have to deny your credit. After the course, we will email everyone a 10-question multiple choice exam, and you must receive a 70% to pass. If you do fail and don't receive the 70%, we will send you a link to another quiz. And once we've obtained your passing score, then we'll send you a course completion document to your email provided. If you have any questions or concerns, please email to fieldoutreach@thealmondboard.com. And thank you, everyone, for being here. So I'd like to present our moderator, Drew Wolter, who is our Senior Specialist in Pest Management at the Almond Board, and he will be discussing further on the post-harvest weed management.
All right, thank you, Miranda, for that introduction, and welcome everybody. So post-harvest weed management. I'm going to start with talking about integrated weed management. So the basis for any good orchard floor management plan should stem from integrated weed management principles. This is generally composed of 5 different pieces. So prevention, mechanical, cultural, chemical, and you can see here biological I have slightly separated from this integrated weed management program. Why? Most of our perennial systems don't really have biological components integrated for integrated weed management. But this could be anywhere from using goats or sheep to control weeds. Here are a few examples, and I'll get into this a little bit more later on throughout the slides. But mechanical, this can include anything from hand pulling, tillage, burning, which is also known as flaming, mowing, and some of the other emerging technologies that are coming up in our industry, which I have a survey for a little bit later. But this can include superheated air or the electrostatic control of weeds. Then we have the cultural components. So this can include anything from cover crops, burning your tree rows. What this will do is wick the moisture away from your tree root crowns and kind of prevent some of that germination of weeds throughout the spring and summer. And lastly, keeping weeds in ditches and canals under control. The idea here is to stop the spread of weeds from entering your orchard. Then there's the chemical application. Here I've really kind of just provided more of the application stewardship for chemicals. So first and foremost, there's the proper weed identification. Why is this important? So proper weed identification allows for the selection of proper management strategies and awareness of which herbicide-resistant weeds are prevalent in your region. Then there's the use of tank mixes with different modes of action. So why use tank mixes? Using a combination of products with different modes of action not only broadens the range of weeds controlled in a single application, but also reduces the risk of selecting for herbicide resistance and tolerance in your orchard. Then plan ahead across multiple seasons to avoid using herbicides with the same mode of action repeatedly. Again, this is to prevent selecting for herbicide resistance. Overall, what this encompasses is the 4 R's: the right time, right place, right rate, and rotate. Then we have prevention. So this is the basis, and I believe any sort of good orchard floor management program should incorporate a lot of prevention tools. So this can include anything from avoiding contamination, and what I mean by that would be ordering some compost, for example. Season's over, you want to apply some compost down your tree rows, make sure you trust the source that you're ordering that compost from to ensure that they actually cured that compost properly and terminated any of those weed seeds that might be in there. Next, you're looking at avoiding spreading. Now, what that means is if you're using a flail mower or mower in one block or one orchard, make sure you clean that off properly before entering your next orchard or your next block to avoid spreading of seeds. Then there's the control of weeds before they go to seed. The idea here is to really control those annual weeds from just creating a larger and larger seed bank in your orchard. Next is weed scouting. I'll get into that in a moment. So let's talk about resistance versus tolerance a little bit. So the definitions here were provided by the Herbicide Resistant Action Committee. So resistance, weeds that were originally susceptible to an herbicide. Over time, control is lost through the selection of resistant individuals. This differs from tolerance. Now, this is something that you can see out in your orchard quite a bit, especially with weeds that have that hairy or pubescent nature to them on their leaf surface that really stops the absorption or contact of herbicides. So again, tolerance is the inherent ability of a species to survive following an herbicide treatment. This was never susceptible. A little bit more terminology just to help us as we move forward throughout this lecture. So mode of action. This describes the biochemical process by which the herbicides affects weeds. A good example here would be disrupting photosynthesis. That's the mode of action of that herbicide. Then we get into the site of action. The exact location of inhibition, such as interfering with the activity of a specific enzyme within the metabolic pathway. So for example, this could be glyphosate. That is the EPSPS binding site. That's the metabolic pathway that glyphosate acts on. So that's the site of action. Stuff, cross resistance and multiple resistance, which is becoming more and more a problem globally. So cross resistance is the resistance to 2 or more herbicides that share the same mode of action. So this could be dotted weed, for example. This is resistant to both diquat and paraquat, but they're both within that same group. That's group 22. Then there's multiple resistance, resistance to 2 or more herbicides with different modes of action. A good example of this, which we're all becoming fairly familiar with in California, is Palmer amaranth. This is resistant to both groups 2 and 9. So a little bit more on herbicide resistance. How does this happen? This is caused, again, by the selection pressure exerted by the repeated use of an herbicide with the same mode of action. So it doesn't have to be the same product, it just has to be the same mode of action being used over and over again. Next, we have kind of a trick question here. This kind of trips people up sometimes. So do herbicides cause resistance? And the answer is herbicides do not cause resistance. Instead, they select for naturally occurring resistant traits. And we can look at that over here in this graph. So first, an herbicide is sprayed, and you could see this one in green here owns some of those resistant traits. Now that resistant plant survives, goes to seed if you're not catching it, which is again why you should practice scouting and monitoring in your orchard so you can catch stuff like this. Then there's the herbicide use on weeds with resistance in that population. So now what you're looking at is this weed again, you use the same herbicide mode of action. Now your population is growing, and eventually those plants form a larger and larger stand if you're not monitoring. So mechanisms of herbicide resistance. This is composed of 4 different mechanisms. This includes altered target site, enhanced metabolism, compartmentalization or sequestration, and overexpression of a target protein. And I'll get into those a little bit. So target site mutation. This is also known as the lock and key method. So here you see in amino acid production, the weed can grow just fine as long as these two fit perfectly. Here's an active herbicide molecule fitting in that same lock and key site, stopping the amino acid production, which then leads to the death of the weed. Now, when a mutation occurs, you can see here's the usual path. Now that mutation has occurred, the plant found a way to adapt, and no longer can that herbicide enter. So again, here's an example of a point source mutation. Now we move into enhanced metabolism. So this occurs more often during high temperatures, so not good for us in California since we, in the Central Valley, experience a lot of high temperatures throughout the summer. This also increases during increased CO2 conditions with sufficient nitrogen. And the main actor in this is cytochrome P450, which produces an enzyme which metabolizes the toxic compounds. And all that means is that it breaks it down into other metabolites that are no longer toxic to the plant. So now the herbicide is inactive before it can reach the action site. Now compartmentalization or sequestration. So here the herbicide may be active either through or inactivated either through vacuole sequestration. So again, it enters the cytosol, enters the plant, and then gets sequestered out to the cell wall where it can no longer have any sort of effect on the weed. Overexpression of the target protein. If the weed can produce the target protein in large enough quantities, again, now the herbicide just simply cannot overcome the number of proteins that it needs to target to form any sort of necrosis in the plant. So now here's some statistics here. So number of herbicide resistant weeds by weed family. This is going to be interesting because Ben's going to talk a little bit more about the control of grasses later on, and this is why it's important. So here you see, here are the top 10. What's at the top and definitely far and beyond anything else in this list here is Poaceae. That's all the grasses that we exhibit. So now why does this happen? Grasses generally have anywhere from being a diploid, a tetraploid, or a hexaploid, meaning they could have 2, 4, or 6 chromosomes to form recombinations with to find a way of forming resistance. Okay, so now we have weed species resistance to multiple herbicide sites of action. So again, we went over that terminology. And I have a question for you guys. Is there a pattern in the top 8 here that you guys could see? So again, the importance of understanding how to control grasses is shown here. The top 8 are all grasses, most of which are prevalent in California, and especially in the Central Valley. So weed scouting. This is going to help you not only get out there and properly identify the weeds in your orchard, but again, manage your herbicide resistance that may be forming in the orchard. So scouting for weeds is the basis for any good integrated weed management program, like I mentioned earlier. While weeds are present in every orchard, there's variation in weed species and phenology, and then the composition and density. For example, an orchard in the third leaf will have a greater amount of sunlight hitting the orchard floor compared to a mature orchard. Just that change in lighting will drastically affect the species composition of weeds prevalent in each orchard. Then we move into why weed scouting is also important. Most weed species are much more challenging to control as they mature. So for example, here, many of you are with this one. It's ubiquitous across California. That's malva. Much, much harder to control when it matures at this stage. When you can find it in its immature state, you can control it mechanically or chemically fairly easily. But as it matures, mechanical control of this becomes much more difficult because of its extensive taproot, and chemical applications will do little to nothing. So starting should be done at the start of the season and post-harvest. This gives you a chance to both see whether or not your pre-emergent program is working well and your post-emergent program. And again, allows for the monitoring of herbicide resistance. So here I'm going to list a few species that are fairly common both in the San Joaquin and the Sacramento Valley, but keep in mind these are not solely the ones that you should be looking out for. I would definitely go online and look for the current state of herbicide resistance. Google that, and you could see which species are prevalent in California at the moment. But I am going to show you 4 of the most common ones I've seen in California so far. So first, we're going to go over jungle rice, or Echinochala colonna, which is a clumping summer annual grass. So again, summer annual, and inhabits summer irrigated cropping systems and other disturbed sites, and germinates throughout the summer. So this can happen late fall or late spring, throughout the summer. In the next few slides, I'm going to show in blue key identifying features. So for this species, a red to purple band on the blades is fairly common in all the biotypes we have in California. Now you will find jungle rice that will not have this band on the blades, but this is a key identifying feature for most of them out there. You can even see in the seedling, it already has that band showing as well. Next, we're going to move into Russian thistle, so Salsola tragus. This is common throughout California, and especially in the southern region. It grows best in loose, sandy soil. So again, this is why it's much more common in the southern portion of the Central Valley. And stems are slender and flexible and often have this reddish to purple stalk. So again, key identifying feature when you're out there looking for this guy. Now, this is one you do not want to let get away. As you can see here, this is also known as tumbleweed. Why don't you want to let it get out of control? I'm sure some of you have seen photos like this in news articles or even on the highway going across some of the I-5 as you head south. Next, we have horseweed, also known as mare's tail. The scientific name for this one's Canyza canadensis. This is another summer annual, but it can behave as a biannual broadleaf. So what that means is it will have 2 years to its growth cycle, sometimes staying in a rosette state for the first year and bolting in the second year. So cotyledons, which are the seed leaves, as you can see here, are oval to egg-shaped, hairless to densely covered with short, stiff hairs. The image here, you could see this is definitely one that's covered in those short pubescent hairs. Now again, if you remember, I talked earlier about a species that's tolerant. This is a good example of one. This is a fairly tolerant species. As plants mature, it forms a single hairy stem up to 6 feet tall. So again, here's a mature state, going to seed and producing flowers at this point. And here's that identifying feature. Look at the stem and find these hairs on it. So it flowers from June through September. You want to prevent that from happening because it is in the aster family, meaning the seed can spread far. It has pappus, which is just like a dandelion, where if you blow it, it can get caught in the wind. So this is one you do want to be on top of. Lastly, I'm going to cover one that we're all starting to see now that temperatures are dropping, which is annual bluegrass. So this is one of the most common winter weeds in California, and I'd say throughout the US, where germination really starts late summer or fall as soil temperatures drop below 70 degrees Fahrenheit. This one only grows 6 to 8 inches high when left unmowed, and the key identifying feature here is looking at that boat-shaped leaf tip. Now this is common for all the POA genus species where they will have this, but if in combination with its height and identifying that boat-shaped leaf tip, you'll be able to find that. And so most of these species have all been glyphosate resistant that I mentioned to you. So helpful tools for scouting, visit the UC IPM website, go to the almond production page, scroll down to the weed section, and select integrated weed management. There you will see a late fall survey or a spring survey. I brought up the late fall survey here due to the time of the year. And here you'll see a list of common names. This will give you step-by-step directions on how to scout, how to mark down your weeds. And I think a good practice here would be to go ahead and highlight the ones that you know are herbicide resistant. Again, here's annual bluegrass. Go ahead and highlight that. So the first step to preventing herbicide resistance in your orchard is early detection. When monitoring, look for patterns that indicate resistance. And this can include anything from early stages, which individual weeds that have escaped, which will show individual weeds that have escaped control. So this might be one weed in the middle of the tree row where everything else is necrotic, but you see one that's still vibrant green. That's a sign that you have some herbicide resistance developing. Then there's the late stages, or this could be, again, contamination where you brought in some seed. But late stages generally are classified as patches of dense weeds with less dense populations radiating out from that central patch. So proper weed ID is key in this case. You really want to make sure you properly identify weeds. So accurately identifying weed species is crucial for the effective management because herbicide recommendations, mechanical control, or the cultural control strategies all depend on identifying that species properly. While some species can look similar, they may have drastically different management requirements. So for example, here on the left, I have these two inset photos. These are both goosegrass species. One is just goosegrass, Eleusine indica, and then the other on the top here is three-spike goosegrass or Eleusine fristachia. Now they may look similar in the field, but they differ in phenology and control strategies. One is an annual, goosegrass down here, and the other is a perennial, meaning that mowing will only invigorate the perennial, three-spike goosegrass, while mowing can provide control of the annual goosegrass. Another example would be bindweed. This is key to knowing, the key here is knowing phenology and understanding the phenology of this species. It only takes 3 to 7 days for this one to perennialize, meaning the rhizomatous nature of this one becomes such that a chemical application or mowing may have little to no effect on this because each rhizome will just give another plant coming up. So the key here is, again, understanding the phenology. Mowing can lead to exponential growth of this species, and improper timing of chemical applications yields poor results. So targeting the species post-bloom, late in the season, again, this is when carbohydrates are now going down into the root system. If you target this species at that point, you'll ensure that systemic herbicides actually get translocated to that expansive root system, providing greater control. So helpful tool for weed ID. Again, go to UCIPM, go to the almond production page, scroll down to the weed section, and now find a tab will give you options to look at common and scientific names of weeds. When you click on those, they'll give you images, identifying features, and control options. So here we have, again, we're looking at practices for pre-plant. So I'm going to show you first the cultural aspects. So in the cultural aspects, you can have grading of the orchard to minimize low spots. In general, low spots equal perennial weeds. One of the most common ones you'll see in low spots where you have water puddling is nutsedge. A lot of you may be familiar with that. So this one now has corums that where you pull out one plant through manual application, it just gives rise to another plant. Chemical application yields minimal results because again, those corums are underground that give rise to a new plant. Maintain proper drainage is another step, keeping puddles from forming within tree rows. Now again, this is both for annuals and perennials, but the key here is really you need to cut checks into some of those tree berms. If you have your trees berm down a tree row, that can limit the movement of water, and you may need to cut checks into those berms. Why? A, the control of perennial weeds, and B, puddles accelerate the decomposition of herbicides, and especially some of those pre-emergents that we all put out there. The residual period on those will drop. Then we have the mechanical control options to an integrated weed management program. Again, this is at a pre-plant site. So there's the grow kill method. And what I mean by that is when you're setting up your orchard and you're getting it aligned, you can cultivate, irrigate, and then cultivate again. Now what that does is you're cultivating, you're bringing up some of those weed seeds in the seed bank. The irrigation will force some germination, and then you cultivate again, eliminating those seedlings that germinated and knocking down that seed bank. Now this may need to be repeated a few times, but this is a mechanical option where you eliminate some of the use of chemicals. This slowly reduces stand density in seed bank. Then there's cultivation when soil is dry. The key here is make sure that the soil is fairly dry. And this is an effective method of controlling perennial grasses, especially ones that are rhizomatous, such as Bermuda grass and Johnson grass. This cuts the rhizomes into little pieces, and as long as the soil is dry, this will desiccate those rhizomes. Then there's the chemical application. Again, we have many options in an integrated weed management program. So established annual and perennial weeds should first be controlled with post-emergent herbicides. You don't want to go in there when you have seedlings that are already up or mature plants already up. You want to go in there and first control with post-emergent herbicides. Once that's done, a good practice is to put down some pre-emergents so that you can slowly deplete that seed bank once again. Now we move into the integrated weed management control options for middles. So first I'm going to start with cultural. So we're going to look over at cultural here. So cover cropping minimizes the effects of repeated disking, such as soil compaction, reduced infiltration, dust and soil erosion, and weed seeds. So what do I mean by that? So cover cropping will outcompete some of these other species, minimizing the number of seeds or plants that can go to seed, thus reducing gradually the weed seed bank. So benefits of cover crops. So again, now we can get into some of those benefits that growers can obtain through the use of cover crops that don't just include the suppression of weeds. Here we increase organic matter, which leads to greater cation exchange capacity. Now, all that means is that you can retain more nutrients in your soil as long as the pH is right, but organic matter increases cation exchange capacity. Now, if in your cover crop mix, you're mixing in legumes such as vetch, California native can be found there, that increases the natural nitrogen available just because it fixes nitrogen out of the air. Now, improved orchard access is another benefit. Here you can actually access, due to the increased soil infiltration, you can get in there and work your orchard a lot earlier in the season. And again, I just mentioned increased soil water infiltration. and minimizes erosion. Then we're looking at the mechanical options. So mowing is good for annuals and not perennials. Some perennials you'll perhaps be able to control, but the vast majority of them, mowing's only going to invigorate them, especially when we're talking about clumping grasses that are perennials. All this is going to do is invigorate that clump to grow and grow and grow. And if you're not catching it before it goes to seed, you're just going to have a ubiquitous patch throughout your orchard. So shallow disking, this is a good mechanical control option, but be sure not to have repeated use of disking, otherwise you will incur some of these negative impacts that I talked about earlier. So lastly, I want to talk about a survey that's going out. Now, this is a collaboration between UC Davis, Oregon State University, and Cornell University. Each one of these players all were formerly at UC Davis with Dr. Brad Hansen. It's Lynn Sosnowski, which some of you may know as a Cooperative Extension Farm Advisor, formerly in Merced. Caio Brunharo is now at Oregon State University. And UC Davis, that's Dr. Brad Hansen. And what we're really looking at is trying to gauge interest from growers and PCAs with regards to the interest in novel technologies. This is something I talked about earlier in terms of superheated air or electrostatic weed control. So please, we're going to drop that link into the chat box. Please, if you have time, fill that out. It would really help us gauge interest and adoption of these practices moving forward. And with that, I'll take any questions.
All right, Drew, you do have a few questions in the chat box. Miranda.
Yes, I think John had his hand raised. John Campbell.
John, you had a question?
Unmute him.
If you'd like to, John, you can go ahead and take yourself off mute and ask, or drop it in the chat box.
Oh, he has a DPR question.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and reiterate some of the stuff for DPR. We are monitoring the chat box for your time in and time out, and just keeping track to make sure you are meeting the requirements. We will be sending out a quiz link at the end. It'll be dropped in the chat box, and you are going to take a quiz, and you must get a 70% or better to receive credit for the 1 hour of other. If you fail the quiz the first time, we will send a link to you guys.
Drew, there is a question in the chat. Does burning weeds,
via email, and we will go ahead and issue you the second quiz. And keeping track of the attendance, I put it in the chat. I can put it in there again. There will be a RSVP link, and if you can just RSVP so we can keep track of your information. And then also here, after Drew gets done with his presentation, there'll be a checkpoint that you guys all need to like in order for you to receive credit. So I hope that answers your question, John. If not, you can put it in the chat and I can address it one-on-one.
Okay, and then I saw in the chat, Miranda, you were about to bring up, does burning weeds kill the entire weed, or does the root still remain? So the answer here is ground speed will have a lot to do with the efficacy that you end up getting with burning weeds. But in short, flaming or burning weeds is not going to actually have any sort of effect on the root system. So for perennials, this is where you're going to run into trouble. For annuals, again, you go ahead and burn the tissue above ground. You've solved that problem, especially if your speed is going at the right rate, if you're moving at the right rate. But perennials, this is not going to work well for you.
And then it also looks like there's a hand raise for guests with the number 160-554-905. If you would like to ask your question or drop it in the chat. All right, Drew. I want to say that's it for now. If another one pops up, I'll go ahead and get your attention.
Okay, great. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to email me or give me a call. My information's up there. And let's see, move into the DPR Credit Participant Check-in. So we're going to drop in the chat window as we speak the link or the credit, this emoji or sign right here. And all we need you to do is go ahead and like that. Let's see. Should be dropped in there in just a sec.
It is dropped in there, so please go ahead and put a thumbs up to let us know that you are actively participating in the webinar. And to do so, just go up to the chat box and go ahead and hit like.
Yep, there we go.
I see them popping through.
For those of you that don't know how to do that, I've moved the Teams meeting window here. So again, just move over, hover over, and select that you liked it.
And I see someone saying they can't find the chat box up at the top. Drew, if you can show them where the chat box is on your end, that'd be great.
Since I'm in presenter, I'm not seeing it at the moment.
Okay, no worries. It's actually up at the top of the screen where it says show participants, and it looks like it says hide conversation or show conversation. But it's okay, Robert. You responded, so I now know that you've been actively participating.
Okay, great. Next up, we have Duesterhaus with Mid-Valley Ag, and I'm going to go ahead and transfer over control, Ben. You should have control now. There might be a slight delay as we experienced earlier.
Okay.
And as we're waiting for Ben to get situated, if you cannot find the meme, just go ahead and put a thumbs up in the chat box or just a hi so we know you're actively participating.
Okay.
Thank you, Ashley. Okay, whenever you're ready, Ben.
Okay. It's, can you hear me, Drew?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. I want to thank you guys for the opportunity to share a little bit of information. Drew, you did a fantastic job of going over a lot of basically what I have to talk about. It's so fantastic. Takes a lot of pressure off of me not to have to perform now. I'm an agronomist with Mid-Valley Agricultural Services, and just wanted to share kind of some of the observations and things we've made since I've been here with Mid-Valley, and spend a little bit of time emphasizing post-harvest weed control, especially in lieu of, let's see, here we go, in lieu of maybe some changes that have been taking place and some of those grasses that Drew already mentioned. Drew already covered this in pretty good detail, but we do like to think of post-harvest or in the entire, weed control program. I think you need to spend more time developing a plan and have some specific goals in mind. What weeds are out there, we've covered that. Also, orchards age, your location in regard to some sensitive environmental areas, possible neighboring crop sensitivity to materials you want to use. All of those are going to play a role in your choices that you make. And we need to plan, so proper timing of application can be made. And I hope by the time this is finished, that timing is something that is something more front of mind, especially with a couple of the weeds that we'll talk about at the end. Timing, especially with some different materials we'll be using going forward. Let's see. Okay. So for post-harvest weed control considerations, I think of the original from when I came out here as I'm going to wait until post-harvest weeds have emerged. I'm going to wait till some rain is in the forecast. Maybe that's the middle or later part of December. And I'm going to try to control emerged weeds at the same time that I'm going to try to put down a residual herbicide. I totally understand this makes sense. It would make sense to me as a grower as well. You know, got some fatigue. You know, you've been making pre-harvest applications for weed management. You've been spraying for navel orange worm and mites through hull split timing and maybe even through the harvest window. You've been harvest activities, getting your irrigation system back up and functioning properly, post-harvest fertilizer, trying to get the trees ready for the following year. So there's definitely some grower fatigue, and I understand why we'd want to give ourselves a little bit of time to wait. And there's probably some fatigue on the wallet as well. There's been a lot of money spent, and we'd like to get everything done in one pass and and save some money on an application cost. The challenge it does lead to, though, by waiting that long is we can get some very large weeds that we have to try to control with our post-emergent program. And sometimes those things they're being subjected to frost, which can make it more of a challenge to control them. They're less receptive to the herbicide spray. And in years where we're having wet weather, a lot of dew and fog, it can be difficult when we start early in the morning to actually get our spray to deposit through that dew and fog or displace that moisture on the foliage so we can achieve control. So when I moved out here 14 years ago, this was what I was used to seeing. Malva, Fillery, small fleabane, mare's tail, all of these typical broadleaf weeds. And, a lot of emphasis was placed on controlling those. And we have a lot of really good materials, post-emerge and pre-emerge, and we can do a fantastic job at controlling these problematic broadleaf weeds. It's so that was the norm when I got here 14 years ago, was to have a lot of emphasis and focus on controlling these, and we have the tools to do that. Something I've noticed in more recent times, though, seems like some shifts. This was a few years ago. Grower wanted to wait to his traditional timing to put on his residual herbicide. Well, it started to rain in December, and it kept raining. So this area he was unable to treat. And as you can see, this is a ryegrass stand, complete coverage in this conventional orchard. This isn't an organic orchard. And so that created a really big challenge come springtime. You can see we're blooming here, so it's really, it's mid-February, and they were never able to get a post-emerge herbicide application put on because it started raining before they could get to it. And because we have such a dense mat of weeds out here, any residual herbicide that would have been applied at this time wasn't going to make good contact with the soil surface. So in essence here, we didn't save a pass by waiting in this situation. We actually created another situation where we had to make 2 herbicide applications, one to get the strips cleaned up, and then the second application to get a residual down onto the soil after we had enough ground cover cleared up. In this trial, I'm just kind of showing a couple different materials. One people may not think of as having pretty good activity on ryegrass, rimsulfuron and flumioxazin combined with a good rate of glyphosate. Did a really nice job of controlling these emerged grasses up to 4 and 6 inches tall. I wouldn't say that this is residual control here 80 days after. It didn't rain after we made the application. So just some different ways to think about trying to control glyphosate resistant ryegrass. Another problem we're starting to run into is we've got pockets with sethoxidin, tolerant or resistant, whatever we want to call it, ryegrass in the same places where we have glyphosate resistance. Sethoxidin has, long been a very good material for us to control ryegrass. And in these specific areas, it's ineffective at this point in time. So we've had to resort to use of contact materials like paraquat added to glyphosate, or glufosinate added to with paraquat added to that. Two things take home from this is glyphosate with a glufosinate combination is not going to be effective at controlling these large ryegrass plants. We tried that in this area. So that's not going to be an effective treatment. And then also, this was 40 gallons of water applied going 2.5 miles an hour with a boom over the top of these grasses. You can see we got really good control. But ground speed is going to dictate whether you're able to truly control these this well or not. If you're trying to control large grasses with contact materials and you're going 5 miles an hour, putting out even 50 gallons of water, you won't be this efficacious. So you need to make sure and slow down so you get better coverage. I know that adds time to the operation, but it's going to give you much better performance. Ground speed is the real key to this application working. And something that is becoming more and more common. This was a picture I took Monday, and it's from an orchard right in the Oakdale area. And many of you are probably seeing the same thing. I don't see the malva, I don't see the fillory, I see bluegrass, annual bluegrass. And if I was to look at this roll, and I would think, not a problem. This is going to be very easy for me to deal with. It's just bluegrass. It all came up, you know, in the irrigation that I put on post-harvest. I've got time to get out here to make my application, no problem. Well, I want to pose to you that there's definitely some consideration that needs to take place when it's dealing with this annual bluegrass. And this is just a close-up of one of those irrigated circles where the bluegrass came up. You can see there's already bluegrass gone to the reproductive stage. You can see the seed head beginning to emerge out of one of those tillers. Well, this is not an actively growing weed anymore. When grasses convert from vegetative stage to reproductive stage, they're not actively growing. And if we read any of the systemic herbicide labels like glyphosate or cythoxidam, clethodim, those materials, they all say to apply to small weeds that are actively growing for best results. And we know that to be true also with our contact materials. So even though the size of this weed does not look very menacing, these are the exact ones that are going to be the myths that we come into a situation like this much later in the year if we wait to make that post-emerge application. This is a picture taken in April from a different location. This was after a late winter application of glyphosate and paraquat that failed in this orchard. A number of the annual bluegrass plants died, but these are the remnants that survived that application. So we showed up and tried to do a kind of looking for tolerance to paraquat. And so we did 3 different carrier volumes, 20, 30, 40 gallons, and we put on 5 pints of paraquat per treated acre, which is almost 2x the rate for the particular paraquat that we were using. And we achieved 0 control of this population. And so like we did in the ryegrass trial, we added glufosinate to the paraquat, and we were able to achieve commercially acceptable control at 20 or 40 gallon per acre carrier volume. This is, you know, from a couple years ago, this is something that was going to be very viable long term, we felt, because paraquat and glufosinate together was working well. As we know now, commercially, paraquat use is going to be greatly challenged because we have some restrictions on the 2.5 gallon containers and up to, I think, the 150 gallon containers that are going to require a closed mixing system, and that's still being worked on at the EPA, so there's currently nothing new to update there. There's not one approved for small containers for a closed mixing system. And then also, we've got new licensing requirements for the mixer and the handlers that have been in place for about, and applicators. Those have been in place for about the last 12 months. So the general use of paraquat is going to be greatly reduced, I feel. And likewise, glufosinate itself is not the greatest winter grass weed control product. It is good, and it's a fantastic herbicide on many, many weeds out there. But for ryegrass and annual bluegrass that you see here in this picture, this application was made in December a few years ago, and this is a few weeks after. We did not get complete control of the annual bluegrass with that 4-pint rate of glufosinate. So that's why I said previously, we're not going to be able to use a glyphosate and glufosinate combination to achieve commercially acceptable control of ryegrass and annual bluegrass without something else being part of the mixture. And unfortunately, with that loss of paraquat, or the greater challenge, we're going to have to get more creative in what our planning strategy is. So that's why I would propose a couple of thought processes that I'm sure many of you have already been exploring. And number one, that's to come in right after your last variety harvests, or after a few irrigations, and right early after we begin to get some germination of weeds in that irrigated zone. We should consider coming in and making a herbicide application at that point to control those very small seedling stage emerged weeds. And in a case where we have micro sprinklers or flood irrigation, we could consider putting on a very low rate of a residual herbicide to help reduce pressure in that irrigated zone. And then when we want to make our traditional herbicide application in winter or very early spring, we have smaller weeds, less dense population out there to control. We'll get better contact with the soil surface with our residual, and have a much better potential, for an efficacious application. I know this does add an application, and talk about this from all the harvest activities. Something else that we tried and the grower really liked was using a residual herbicide prior to harvest. We have a number of materials that have short enough pre-harvest intervals that you could take a look at in this timing. You could add this to your pre-harvest burn down application, or especially where you have sprinkler or flood irrigated blocks, you would be able to incorporate this material. You're not going to get 100% control, obviously, because we're going to have some soil movement with our harvest activities and things like that. But this scenario we used, where we had the glyphosate and a paraquat tolerant or resistant annual bluegrass, worked really well at limiting the number of annual bluegrass plants that came up post-harvest, and made our post-emerge program much simpler. And so I think this is really something we should start to take a look at going forward. We've already touched on this topic quite a bit on the annual bluegrass. We've talked about paraquat struggles to use going forward, and that the glufosinate itself with the glyphosate's not going to be a complete control option for this. There are some other materials that have some promise. If we look at rim sulfuron labels, they actually have annual bluegrass listed for post-emerge activity. Ourselves, we're going to take a little bit of a look at flumioxazin to see if we can get the same sort of benefit there that we saw with the ryegrass. That's to be determined. We don't know the answer to that. But one really nice benefit is that clethodim now does have a bearing tree nut label, and that does include almonds. And this is an exciting new tool that we have gotten to be able to use this year, started last summer, as it becomes more challenging to use paraquat. I want us to focus, though, put some special emphasis on timing of the application of clethodim. When we got the label last summer, we put some applications out with glyphosate and walnuts. Top two pictures there's some crabgrass and there is some jungle rice. And you look at those plants, and if you are used to spraying those with a paraquat in the summer or something that's a burn type material, this looks terrible to you visually because they don't look like they're dead. These plants actually are dead. You just don't know it. And the reason is, we made the application after these plants turned to a reproductive stage. So remember, clethodim is a systemic herbicide. The active ingredient, that's grass. It's a grass-only herbicide, so it's going to be very safe for you to use in your bearing tree crops. But it accumulates after the application. The active ingredient accumulates in the growing points of the grass. Once you've reached the reproductive stage of a grass, the most active growing point is the actual joint in the nodes, and that's where you have your panicle initiation begin, or the seed head initiation begin. So in the bottom picture, in the lower right-hand portion of it, you can see that pinched seed head shoot in it where it's desiccated. That was the attachment of that panicle in the joint. And so the plant has died. It's just taking a very extended period of time to dry down. So again, it's a very different final result compared to paraquat in this instance. However, this is not an efficacious herbicide application because in either of these situations, because we allowed these grasses to produce viable seeds that now are going to be building back into the seed bank and be trying to germinate on us at their next available opportunity. That will be the same case for annual bluegrass. You'll note here, this was done last spring. The grower made an application broadcast to the annual bluegrass in January and did not, get acceptable commercial control. And we're seeing that more and more common with glyphosate as the only material in the tank to control bluegrass. So we came in and did a trial, and we sprayed the tree rows, the traditional herbicide strip, with glyphosate and clethodim in February. And this is a couple of weeks after that application. You can see some greater yellowing over there in the herbicide strip. That's what you're going to get. If you're used to spraying paraquat and you like to see the weeds fried, you're not going to get that end result, with this new tool. Those weeds are dead for all intensive purposes where they're bright yellow. However, again, the same goes for the crabgrass before and the jungle rice. It wasn't an efficacious application because we have many, many viable seeds that now are going to fall down into the soil and be there and be ready to germinate post-harvest next year. So timing is going to be very important. I really encourage us to take a good look now where you have annual bluegrass. I think we need to get started earlier on those post-harvest, post-emergent applications instead of waiting until later if that truly is becoming an issue in your orchards. Clethodim is going to be a really nice material for us. I really believe so. Follow the label. Use the tank mix additives that the label asks for. Spray on time, and we're going to get good results. So kind of in summary, develop a plan and be ready to execute that plan. And where you're having trouble or things are shifting on you, let's not be afraid to try to do something different, especially where we have sprinkler or flood blocks and we have some opportunity to incorporate some residuals at low rates at some different timings that we're currently using so we can have some much less pressure on us through the winter months as we get towards our traditional residual herbicide application time. With that, I just want to say thank you. I hope maybe one or two nuggets in there were useful. And I really do want to thank the Almond Board of California and Drew and Miranda and Ashley for putting this together to help growers and PCAs be able to get hours for their licensing. So thank you all for that.
Thanks, Ben. That was great. let's see here. So, I think control's back here.
Yeah. Okay, so the Almond Conference, here's just a little plug. Our Almond Conference is going to be held December 8th through the 10th. And with that, we are going to be offering some more DPR credits for our industry members on December 10th at 11 a.m. In order to do that and participate into that, we ask you to go and RSVP and become a participant for our Almond Conference. And you can do that at almonds.com. So go ahead and join and register so you can join the journey. As we all know, 2020 has been a little crazy, but we're super excited and really proud of our team for putting on a virtual conference for us, and look forward to hopefully seeing you guys there and participating in the conference as well, and joining the trade show and doing some more DPR credits.